Olá, irmãos, tudo bem com vocês? A paz de Cristo para todos. Aqui em nosso canal nós falamos sobre temas espirituais, sobre temas morais, sobre apologética, que é exatamente defender a fé em Jesus Cristo, defender os ensinamentos de Jesus Cristo. Mas temos muitas pessoas que têm dúvidas sobre alguns temas polêmicos e alguns, volta e meia, falam sobre a Inquisição de forma negativa, não sabendo, contudo, detalhes muito importantes sobre a própria Inquisição, sobre as Inquisições, porque foram várias, muitas não foram iniciadas ou conduzidas pela Igreja Católica, e também os motivos que fizeram tais Inquisições acontecerem. A falta de conhecimento ela é terrível, porque faz as pessoas terem uma imagem da igreja fundada por Jesus Cristo completamente errada. E por isso, neste vídeo, já tinha feito um vídeo sobre as cruzadas, neste vídeo nós vamos esclarecer as dúvidas sobre a Inquisição iniciada e conduzida pela Igreja Católica principalmente. Mas Marcos, por que falar sobre a Inquisição agora? Porque nós precisamos concluir, fechar esse capítulo desses temas polêmicos. Nós já falamos sobre imagens, esse vídeo nós temos um vídeo já falando sobre imagem e outro muito mais aprofundado sobre a questão das imagens católicas. Provavelmente ainda não foi publicado, mas ele já foi feito, já está carregado, já está no YouTube. Nós já falamos sobre o sacramento da confissão, falamos sobre as cruzadas, tem pouco tempo, falamos sobre o absurdo de dizer que a Igreja Católica é a besta do Apocalipse, falamos sobre o papado, que ele não é anticristão, como muitas denominações cristãs acusam o papado de ser, falamos sobre a incompatibilidade total entre o socialismo e o cristianismo. Neste vídeo, vamos falar sobre a Inquisição. E para nós entendermos completamente este episódio histórico, nós precisamos perceber alguns pontos. Primeiro, muitas das vezes, a história que vem para nós não nos revela a verdade, infelizmente. Afinal, toda a historiografia é escrita com contaminações do próprio historiador que a escreveu. Isso eu aprendi na faculdade, sou professor de história. Não é algo que se esconda na faculdade, todos nós sabemos disso. É uma atestação acadêmica. O historiador, quando produz a escrita histórica, que podemos chamar de historiografia, ele acaba sendo parcial. Não é que o historiador não tente a imparcialidade, ele deve tentar alcançar a imparcialidade, mas ele acaba passando para a sua historiografia, para a sua produção historiográfica, o seu lado da história. E isso é uma atestação acadêmica. Nós saímos da faculdade sabendo que isso acontece. E, infelizmente, no mundo inteiro, nós temos muitos comunistas, marxistas, historiadores e iluministas ou equivalentes. Eles acham, por exemplo, que a fé é o oposto da razão e denigrem completamente a fé e o fenômeno religioso. Muitos livros didáticos e fontes historiográficas não são imparciais e não reproduzem o que aconteceu realmente durante a Inquisição, por exemplo. Segundo ponto, ocorre, no mínimo, o anacronismo. O que é isso? É interpretar fatos históricos com os parâmetros, com os valores, com o conhecimento do presente. Para se ter algo próximo da verdade histórica, não podemos nunca fazer isso. Não podemos ser anacrônicos. Pelo contrário, o historiador deve levar em conta o contexto da época, as causas, as consequências, o período histórico, as mentalidades e as culturas, e esses dois pontos são muito importantes, as mentalidades e as culturas deste mesmo contexto histórico, para então escrever ou interpretar tal fato histórico que aqui no momento que nós estamos, o que estamos tratando aqui é a Inquisição. E é exatamente o que vamos ver nesse vídeo. As culturas, as mentalidades, os contextos, as causas e também as consequências. Eu poderia citar aqui as Inquisições protestantes, como a inglesa, a luterana e a calvinista, que muitos protestantes não sabem que ocorreram e que muitas das vezes foram mais bizarras e sanguinárias do que alguns episódios da Inquisição Católica. Mas isso será detalhado mais à frente, sem cometer injustiças. Isso seria repetir o mesmo erro de acusar o próximo, de acusar os católicos sem conhecimento. O que precisamos realmente é seguir em frente, buscando a santidade e a verdade em Jesus Cristo, e não o conflito infrutífero e vazio. Portanto, meus irmãos, nos dois vídeos que eu vou apresentar logo em seguida, quando se falar de Inquisição inglesa, nós estamos falando de uma Inquisição protestante, iniciada por Henrique VIII e o seu anglicanismo. Tudo bem? Agora, a primeira questão que devemos nos fazer quando criticamos a Inquisição é a seguinte: quantos livros de pesquisa científica histórica nós lemos sobre este fato para acusarmos a Inquisição de tantas injustiças? Quantos livros nós lemos? Uma observação importante: não vale livro didático, não vale filme dramatizado e nem seriado. Quantos livros de pesquisa histórica científica nós lemos sobre a Inquisição? É importante para se chegar à verdade dos fatos. Agora eu vou fazer algumas perguntas antes de nós passarmos esses dois pequenos documentários que vão ser muito importantes para a formação do teu conhecimento e para a formação da sua opinião numa busca sincera e honesta pela verdade. Primeira questão: você sabia que antes da Inquisição o próprio povo fazia justiça pelas próprias mãos e os populares cometiam atrocidades contra as pessoas taxadas de bruxas, de necromantes ou coisas do tipo, e que a Inquisição foi um meio para que tais atrocidades não acontecessem de forma intensa como estavam acontecendo? Você sabia que quando alguém era julgado por um tribunal civil, começava a blasfemar só para ser julgado pela Inquisição, que era considerado naquela época o tribunal mais brando de todos? Você sabia que nossos tribunais modernos possuem como fundamento constitutivo os tribunais da Inquisição, pois eram naquela época considerados os mais humanos e justos? Você sabia que a Inquisição espanhola, que foi considerada a mais mortal de todas, sentenciou à morte? Estamos falando da pena capital, tá? De sentenças à morte. Esta Inquisição, que foi considerada a mais mortal, sentenciou à morte cerca de 3 pessoas. Eu não estou falando de 3.000, não. 3 pessoas por ano. E que durante seus 345 anos de existência, estatisticamente falando, foi 14 vezes menos mortífera do que as bicicletas infantis. É isso mesmo. As mortes de crianças causadas por acidentes provocados por bicicletas infantis foram 14 vezes mais mortíferos do que a Inquisição espanhola nos seus 345 anos de existência. É para refletir. Você sabia que muito do que se fala das torturas absurdas feitas pela Inquisição são obra de propaganda contra a Igreja Católica, feita por reformistas protestantes por ocasião da invenção da imprensa? Após minucioso estudo histórico, comprovou-se que tais absurdas torturas nunca existiram. Já vamos ver isso nesses vídeos. Você sabia que os 300 anos de caças às bruxas pela Inquisição são um mito produzido por esta mesma propaganda, que inclusive ocorreu toda a Europa por causa da imprensa, que não havia como provar a bruxaria, não haviam provas materiais deste ato pagão, e por isso a Inquisição espanhola, que é considerada a mais sanguinária de todas, a Inquisição espanhola declarou que a bruxaria era uma ilusão, que não se podia provar que uma mulher era uma bruxa, que ninguém poderia ser processado por isso. Você sabia que em um ano de Revolução Francesa, entre 1793 e 1794, a Revolução matou mais do que 6 séculos de Inquisição Católica? Eu vou repetir. Em um ano de Revolução Francesa, se matou mais do que em 6 séculos, 600 anos de Inquisição Católica. Estupro de freiras, assassinatos de clérigos, de monges. Mas talvez você nunca tenha ouvido falar sobre isso. Bem, de qualquer forma, para não prolongar o vídeo, eu poderia aqui citar vários livros de pesquisa científica histórica para mostrar para vocês que a Inquisição não é esse monstro que pintam e que acaba denegrindo a Igreja Católica. Eu vou citar somente este livro do professor doutor Felipe Aquino para entender a Inquisição. Esse aqui basta para que vocês entendam de uma forma bem tranquila, bem honesta, o que foi a Inquisição. Também cito para vocês o documentário que foi produzido por Thomas Hughes, que também está no YouTube, já está legendado. Vocês podem procurar Igreja Católica, Construtora da Civilização Ocidental. São vários capítulos, dá para você ver em partes, e é muito interessante porque fala também do episódio da Inquisição. E para vocês entenderem que a Revolução Francesa não foi tão gloriosa assim, eu indico para vocês este livro de Edmund Burke, Reflexões sobre a Revolução na França, ok? Vocês vão perceber que esta tal Revolução Francesa acabou inspirando o comunismo e o socialismo, que já mataram mais de 200 milhões de pessoas em todo o mundo. Agora vou passar 2 documentários sobre o assunto Inquisição. Se você quiser continuar vivendo na ignorância, eu digo para aqueles poucos que de forma negativa vêm aqui fazer comentários depreciativos da Igreja Católica, se vocês quiserem continuar vivendo nessa ignorância e julgando erradamente a Inquisição, não precisa assistir. Contudo, eu tenho certeza que valerá a pena, porque são 2 documentários e isso não levará nem 2 horas. E como se trata de um vídeo, você pode ver por etapas. De repente viu 30 minutos hoje, anota que parou aos 30 minutos e depois amanhã vê a partir dos 30 minutos. Você pode ver por etapas. A busca sincera pela verdade é preciosa para a busca do verdadeiro conhecimento e, com certeza, a busca pela verdade que embasa a nossa busca pela santidade e pela nossa salvação. Com certeza valerá a pena. De qualquer forma, já peço que vocês deixem o like, porque ajuda aos nossos vídeos serem recomendados para outras pessoas. Quando você dá o seu like, inclusive o YouTube entende que você quer continuar vendo vídeos no nosso canal, então deixe o seu like, compartilha, se inscreva no canal, fica com Deus, desculpe qualquer coisa e até o próximo vídeo. Fiquem agora com esses dois preciosíssimos documentários.
Trouble at mill.
Oh, no.
Well, Old Crossbean's gone out to go and settle.
What on earth does that mean?
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh, I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition.
My one and only prayer is that someday you care. My hopes, my dreams come true. My one and only you.
How do you plead?
For innocent.
Cardinal!
Someday you'll care for me, but it's
Confess the heinous sin of heresy. Reject the works of the unjust. 2 last chances. And you shall be free. 3 last chances. You have 3 last chances.
my life I give.
Poke her with the soft cushions. Confess. Put her in the comfy chair. Now, you will stay in the comfy chair until lunchtime.
Someday you'll care for me, but it's
Confess! 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 I confess! Not you!
The Spanish Inquisition is infamous. Long before Monty Python's caricature, history had reached its verdict.
A discovery and plain declaration of the Holy Inquisition of Spain, 1567. A court without allegiance to any earthly authority. A bench of monks without appeal. There is nothing else in the world to go beyond them in their most devilish examples of tyranny. Indeed, they do so far exceed all barbarousness, a man cannot more aptly liken them than to that which they most closely resemble, and from whence they proceed, their sire, Satan himself.
Four centuries of condemnation have made the Spanish Inquisition a byword for cruelty, terror, and tyranny. But this image is false, a distortion disseminated 400 years ago and accepted ever since. Now a new generation of historians is looking at the Inquisition afresh. Every one of the cases that came before the Spanish Inquisition during its 350-year history had its own file. These files, gathered together from sources such as this library in Salamanca, are being properly studied for the first time.
I think our views of the Inquisition have been changed largely by the opening up of the archives of the Inquisition. They had everything on tape, as it were, hidden away in their archives. And we can go there, calculate, put it all on computer, and arrive at very firm statistics about its activity. And so all of this has opened wide the debate about the Inquisition, and has also demolished totally the previous image, which all of us had.
The files are detailed and exhaustive. The Inquisition kept its activities secret from the outside world, but its clerks wrote down every detail in the confidence that their records were for the eyes of the Inquisition only. The huge task of sifting this material, previously scattered throughout Spain, daunted earlier generations. Systematic analysis is only just beginning, but already a very different version of the Spanish Inquisition can be brought to light. The Spain that gave birth to the Inquisition in the 15th century was barren and isolated on the fringe of Europe, half of its land unproductive, half barely sustaining a meager living, a monotonous, burning plain. No easy routes, no natural center, no one leader. Spaniards could only dream of Hispania, the country that had been united during the days of the Roman conquest. All that was to change. On the morning of October the 18th, 1469, Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Aragon, and Isabella, heiress of Castile, were married. Their wedding ended centuries of rivalry between the two Spanish kingdoms and would unite the country. Spain, for so long merely a name on the map, had become a historical fact. The itinerant royal court often convened in the city of Avila, here at the monastery of Santo Tomas, its facade triumphantly incorporating an H for the reunified Hispania. But for Ferdinand and Isabella, there could be no political unity without religious unity. They were called the Catholic kings and vowed to rule a Catholic Spain. Pressure was exerted on Spain's large Jewish population to convert. Many did. But traditional Christians were suspicious that these conversos were practicing their former religion in secret. Synagogues, such as this one in Toledo, came under scrutiny. In 1480, a new body was appointed to investigate. Entitled the Santo Oficio de la Inquisición, it's better known to us as the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition's task was to discover heresy, deviation from the true faith. Conversos accused of continued Jewish worship could be burnt at the stake. The Inquisition had begun, but the myth had yet to be created. For while these years between 1480 and 1510 were by far the most active in the entire history of the Inquisition, the rest of Europe did not hurry to condemn it.
Tenemos noticias muy precisas de embajadores italianos, el embajador de Venecia, el embajador de Francia, el embajador de Florencia, que escriben a los reyes católicos felicitándoles, naturalmente, porque ya, por fin, las tierras de Iberia son tierras de cristiandad.
The truth is that at its height, the Inquisition was applauded by the rest of Europe for its persecution of Spain's converted Jews. A new age of Christian unity was said to be dawning. It didn't last. In 1517, the Church was split in two by the Reformation. It was the enormous power and wealth of the Church that the Protestant reformers made their target. A power and wealth still on display every year in Spain's religious capital, Toledo. Until then, priests had been the unquestioned mediators between God and the sinful world, essential to salvation. But the reformers declared that men came to God by faith alone, sola fide. In turmoil, the Church went on the offensive. The Church's champion, defender of the faith, was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. As leader of the Habsburg dynasty, he also commanded the most powerful armies in Europe. But Charles was more than just a Habsburg. As Ferdinand's grandson, he ascended to the throne of Spain, putting that country at the forefront of the defense of the faith. At the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, his enemies were virtually annihilated. Routed on the battlefield, the reformers attacked elsewhere. Where the Church had the sword, the reformers had the printing press. It was no coincidence that printing was invented and spread fastest in the countries most sympathetic to the Reformation, the German states, England and the Low Countries, where this press in Antwerp still survives. With their new technology, the Protestants could fight a different kind of war.
For the first time, it was possible to wage a real propaganda campaign. This is what the enemies of the Spanish Habsburgs did, very skillfully. The Spanish monarchy was unable to counteract that. They fought in the military domain and not in the propaganda domain, and they felt that that was an unfair way of waging a war. That was not proper of gentlemen. Gentlemen fought with weapons, not with leaflets, not with ideas.
This scum of barbarians, this mongrel generation, Spain, is and ever hath been the sink, the puddle, and filthy heap of the most loathsome, infected, and slavish people that ever lived. Their more than tigerish cruelty, their lustful and inhumane deflowering of their matrons, wives, and daughters, their matchless and sodomitical ravishings of young boys, which these demi-barbarian Spaniards have committed.
Within a year of the Battle of Mühlberg, a stream of anti-Spanish invective began to pour off the printing presses of the Reformation. But the polemic needed a focus. It found one in the body expressly designed to uphold the Catholic faith, the Inquisition. A myth was in the making. All the different accusations came together in this document, a discovery and plain declaration of sundry subtle practices of the Holy Inquisition of Spain, printed in 1567. Within the year, it was translated into English, French, Dutch, and German. Its author, masquerading as a Protestant victim of the Inquisition, wrote under the pseudonym Montanus. By identifying with the victim, Montanus brought the supposed horrors of the Spanish Inquisition vividly alive. It is his work which introduced to the world an image of the Inquisition which has persisted ever since.
These tormentors are wholly arrayed all over from the top of their heads to the soles of their feet in a suit of canvas, like the apparel that the devils in stage plays do use, and all to this end, to make the poor soul more afraid in body and mind to see one torment him in the likeness of a devil.
Montanus contributed decisively to what became known as the Black Legend.
The Black Legend is the name given by the Spaniards to the image created by their enemies, according to which they were greedy, cruel, tyrannical, and especially intolerant in religious terms. And of course, the role played by the Inquisition, especially in intolerance, was crucial. The Inquisition was the cornerstone of this construction.
In the early years of the 16th century, to combat the rising tide of religious unorthodoxy, the Pope gave Cardinal Jimenez of Spain leave to move without let or hindrance throughout the land in a reign of violence, terror, and torture that makes a smashing film. This was the Spanish Inquisition.
Es un experto en derecho y forma parte del conjunto de la administración. Lo del clérigo fanático no es más que producto naturalmente de muchas interpretaciones un tanto sesgadas de la propia historia de la Inquisición, claro.
There were career men who didn't even have to be priests. In the early period of the Inquisition, we have examples of some inquisitors who were not even priests. They were simply lawyers trained at the university. And then they would use the Inquisition merely as a career which could be a stepping stone maybe to another career.
This more humdrum reality can be seen in early illustrations of the Inquisition at work. But bureaucrats make boring copy. Montanus' version relied on the Gothic drama of hooded fiends. It was not enough for the Inquisitor to be portrayed as a religious fanatic. He had to have a further interest: torture.
The abuse of this Inquisition is most execrable. If any word shall pass out of the mouth of any, they command him to be taken and put into a horrible prison. Add to the horrors of the prison the injuries, threats, whippings and scourgings, irons, tortures and racks which they there endure. Murdered by long torments, they are whole days together treated more cruelly out of all comparison than if they were in the hangman's hands to be slain all at once.
Montanus associated the Inquisition forever with the horrors of the torture chamber. In time, even these stories of repeated cruelty began to pall. The propagandists turned to stories of more ingenious sadism.
One of them surpassed the others in fiendish ingenuity. Its exterior was a large doll, having the appearance of a beautiful woman. A semicircle was drawn around her, and the person who passed over this fatal mark touched a spring, which caused the diabolical engine to open. It immediately clasped him, and 1,000 knives cut him in as many pieces.
In fact, the Inquisition uses torture very infrequently. In Valencia, for example, I found that out of over 7,000 cases, only 2% experienced any torture at all, and usually for no more than 15 minutes. And less than 1% suffered repeated torture, in other words, more than once. I found no one suffering torture more than twice.
We find, comparing the Inquisition, merely within Spain with other tribunals, that the Inquisition used torture less than other tribunals. And if we compare the Inquisition with tribunals in other countries, we find that the Inquisition has a virtually clean record in respect of torture.
During the same period in the rest of Europe, vicious punishments could be prescribed for an enormous number of different offences. In England, you could be executed for damaging shrubs in public gardens. If you returned to Germany from banishment, you could have your eyes gouged out. In France, you could be disemboweled for sheep stealing. The Inquisition used none of these methods. They had a rule book, the Instrucciones, which specified what could and could not be done. Those breaking the rules were sacked. So the Inquisition did not, as alleged, roast their victims' feet, or brick them up to languish for all eternity, or smash their joints with hammers, or flail them on wheels. They never used the Iron Maiden. This Iron Maiden, one of only a few examples to survive, was built in Germany. The Inquisitors didn't ravish their female victims, although a rich and undeniably popular tradition suggests that they did. In fact, the inquisitorial torture chamber of popular myth never existed, even though this image was reprinted hundreds of times. And it was not only the use of torture that was falsified. Stories were also fabricated about the gruesome conditions in which prisoners were kept.
Ironically, the Inquisition had probably the best jails in Spain. This sounds very much like whitewashing, but unfortunately it's true. Let me take a quotation from the Inquisitors in Barcelona in the middle of the 16th century, when they were asked to report on the state of their prisons, and they said, "Our prisons are full." But then they complained to their bosses in Madrid, "We don't know where to send the leftover prisoners we have. We cannot send them to the city jails, because the city jails are overcrowded, and there they are dying at the rate of 20 a week."
I have found instances of prisoners in secular criminal courts blaspheming in order to get into the Inquisition prison, to escape the maltreatment they received in the secular prison.
So, despite the compelling Gothic fictions of Montanus, the evidence leads us to a wholly different conclusion. The inquisitors were certainly interrogators, but they were restrained interrogators, skeptical about the effectiveness of hardship and torture in bringing heresy to light. By contrast with many other tribunals in Europe, they emerge as almost enlightened.
El caso más singular, por ejemplo, es el caso de la brujería. El Tribunal del Santo Oficio fue extraordinariamente benigno con el tema de la brujería, mientras que otras justicias europeas, justicias ordinarias y justicias eclesiásticas no tuvieron ni mucho menos la misma consideración con este tipo de delito.
Proclama mi alma la grandeza del Señor.
Whatever crime they were investigating, the inquisitors went by the book. The persecution of witches was a frenzy that swept through Europe for 300 years, between 1450 and 1750. At the merest accusations of a fantastical offense, sleeping with the devil or bearing his children, women were brutally tortured or burnt at the stake. The depravity of their alleged crimes was cited to justify this brutal response. One tribunal took a different approach.
Remember that the inquisitors were university lawyers, and lawyers look for evidence. So when the inquisitors looked for evidence of witchcraft, they said, okay, so this woman has killed a baby. Where is this baby? How many babies have died? And so on and so forth. And as they went through looking for the evidence, they found no evidence because, of course, witchcraft was, we may presume, an imaginary offense.
While the rest of Europe reacted with horror, the Spanish Inquisition declared witchcraft a delusion. No one could be tried, let alone burnt for it. But it was the Spanish Inquisition that came to symbolize the ruthless persecution of heresy. Why? Because by the 1560s, Spain was more than just a power. It was a superpower. Its fitting symbol, the new royal palace, a 16th century pentagon built in the hills above Madrid, El Escorial. This vast structure, comprising miles of marbled corridors, was built by Charles V's son and successor, Philip II. Under Philip, Spain completed its rise within less than a century from isolation and obscurity to the domination of Europe. Philip was at the pinnacle of earthly power, but like his father Charles, he had a higher loyalty.
Before suffering the slightest damage to religion and the service of God, I would lose all my estates and 100 lives if I had them, because I do not wish nor do I desire to be the ruler of heretics.
Confronted by such fervor and strength, Spain's enemies changed tack. Their new target would be the king himself.
Philip II is an excellent example of the distortions and the creations, very successful creations in this case, of the Black Legend. Philip II was presented as a monster. That's an example of the cruelty of the Spanish race. Philip II really, his policies are perfectly debatable. Personally, I don't like him, but he was no more of a monster than, say, Henry VIII of England. And Henry VIII, nevertheless, was cleaned up in order to be presented as a fit champion of Protestantism.
Philip took no such trouble with the presentation of his image, believing it beneath his dignity. He paid dearly for it. In 1568, the year after Montanus was published, A chance incident played into the propagandist's hands. The king's son, Don Carlos, died suddenly. Suspicion lighted on Philip, and it was claimed that he had not acted alone.
Among the aspects of the Black Legend, which became very current in the 16th century onwards, was that the Inquisition had encouraged the King of Spain, Philip II, to kill his own son, to execute his own son, for reasons which the king knew best and which the inquisitors knew best. For this legend, of course, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, or to be even more firm, it is totally false, totally unsubstantiated.
His son and heir, Don Carlos, was an insane, very problematic teenager who died in an accident. But Don Carlos became something like a champion of freedom, and he was the protagonist of many plays and dramas and novels in the 17th and 18th century, the most famous of which was by Schiller, later converted into a beautiful opera, by the way, by Giuseppe Verdi.
In Verdi's opera, Don Carlos declares before God his allegiance to Flanders, a Habsburg province ruled by his father the king, but with strong Protestant sympathies and by now seeking its independence. Defying his monstrous father, Don Carlos is portrayed as a heroic symbol of resistance, his mission to defeat the forces of repression. The next act opens with the king in an agony of doubt. Alone in his chambers at night, he ponders how to punish his errant son. His Christian conscience prevents him taking the most drastic step of all, until a visitor persuades him otherwise. The Grand Inquisitor, portrayed as an old blind man, listens as the king pours out his anguish. Then, through his uncompromising arguments, the Inquisitor gradually overcomes the king's reluctance and persuades him to kill his son. The Grand Inquisitor decides the issue by observing that there is a precedent. The opera is fiction from start to finish, and the most influential distortion concerns the Inquisition, which can come and go as it pleases, here in Philip's private quarters at El Escorial, a malign spectral presence feared even by the king, and manipulating affairs of state from behind his throne. The death of Don Carlos was a godsend for the mythmakers. In reality, the Inquisition was no more the power behind the throne than the inadequate prince was a heroic martyr. It was not that the Inquisition was without influence. The showpiece displays of its status were grandiose occasions held in the main squares of the cities, such as this one in Madrid. These ceremonies, where heretics were sentenced, were known as acts of faith. Present were the competing power brokers, other church authorities, secular institutions, and the aristocracy.
All of these other institutions are powerful. They all have the ear of the king. They are competing and conflicting institutions. So the Inquisition has to operate within that framework. Its power, therefore, is constantly being curbed and opposed by the representatives of other institutions equally powerful.
it's still possible to capture a sense of the many different power blocks then competing in Spanish society during the Corpus Christi parade in Toledo. Every one of the city's medieval guilds has its own special place in the procession and its own distinctive regalia. Such limitations, however, were as nothing compared to the difficulties encountered by the Inquisition outside the city walls. In 16th century Spain, 4 out of every 5 inhabitants lived in the countryside. The Inquisition was divided into 20 tribunals. Each of them had to cover thousands of square miles. Yet each tribunal had no more than 2 or 3 inquisitors and a handful of administrative clerks. Contemporary accounts revealed that the inquisitors detested and often shirked their sorties into rural Spain. In winter, the roads were impassable, so visitations often had to be undertaken in the burning heat of summer. A letter from a village priest in 1562 is typical. This village, he wrote, does not know the Holy Inquisition.
Era muy difícil controlar las áreas rurales, absolutamente imposible. Y de hecho, cuando lo intentó, se encontró con enormes dificultades. De hecho, podemos decir que durante el siglo XVI y XVII muchos campesinos castellanos no vieron nunca un inquisidor ni tampoco vieron nunca un auto de fe.
Those inquisitors who persevered with visitations to remote villages encountered a level of ignorance that made a mock of their elaborate theological training. Rural life was precarious, often lived under the threat of starvation. The villagers' beliefs were correspondingly primitive. Their only religious certainty was that death awaited them, and after death, damnation, where their punishment would be ingenious and eternal. But the gulf between the Inquisition and rural Spain was even deeper than appeared at first sight.
Let us be very careful tomorrow when the Inquisitor comes here. For the love of God, don't go telling tales about each other or meddle in things touching the Holy Office.
A parish priest's warning betrays the Inquisition's real problem. Their investigations simply met with a wall of silence. They were alleged to have developed a network of spies to breach it, the familiares.
This is another element that has been greatly misunderstood. The familiares were certainly not a network of spies. They were rather lay individuals who would volunteer to assist the Holy Office in many areas, particularly simply by accompanying prisoners from outlying areas.
The least credible parts of the myth of the Inquisition, I suppose, are those relating to its image as being a super omnipotent institution capable of controlling the thoughts and minds of people. These inquisitors had no power to control society in the way that many historians have imagined that they had. They had no power, they had no function, they didn't have the tools to do the job. And we, in falsifying the image, have given them the tools which have never existed.
Powerless in the country, overshadowed in the city, the real Inquisition is scarcely recognizable from its myth. But it is Verdi's vision which persists of an Inquisition which can command a king and force a subject people to kneel in fear before it. In 1570, 2 years after the death of Don Carlos, the propagandists achieved an even greater coup. The Spanish armies occupying much of Europe were alleged to be paving the way for the introduction of the Spanish Inquisition. A document, now proved a forgery, was circulated. It claimed to reveal that the entire population of one country, the Netherlands, had forfeited any right to life or property. Here was an Inquisition bent on mass killings to punish heresy.
It's when we look at the figures for executions, only dealing with executions as distinct from the psychological impact of the Inquisition, that we come up against a very remarkable fact, namely that in 16th century Spain, and dealing only in terms of Protestant heresy, fewer people died for heresy in Spain than in any other Western country. The Inquisition, for example, in the whole of the 16th century, maybe executed something like about 40 or 50 people at the outside in the whole of Spain, in the whole of the 16th century, and that includes, of course, the whole of America as well. Whereas within a small group of years, which are the reigns of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, we get at least the execution of 400 English people at the hands of, if we may call it, the English Inquisition, namely the English authorities who were in charge of executing people of the opposing religion. And we get the same figures in other countries. We get the same figures in France, where admittedly it was a Catholic authority. They executed something in the course of 5 or 6 years, they executed something like about 300 people. And so whichever country we look at, we find that the number of people who died for heresy in Spain, or for religious persecution of any sort, here I'm including also the conversos, is minimal compared to other countries. So that really, if every country is living in a glass house, none of them could throw stones, because Spain had the cleanest reputation in terms of killing off heretics than any other Western European nation.
This conclusion is based on the statistical research currently being conducted in the Inquisition's archives. Indeed, it's now possible, on the basis of research done by academics such as Professor Jaime Contreras, to arrive at a scientific estimate of the total number of victims of the Spanish Inquisition.
Y podemos decir que la actividad procesal del tribunal fue menor, mucho menor que la que anteriormente se había dicho. El número de víctimas del Tribunal del Santo Oficio durante los 350 años de su actividad no varió entre los 3.000 y las 5.000 personas.
Burning at the stake, an image associated forever with the Spanish Inquisition. But the stake was used to kill heretics in England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia as well. Across the whole sweep of early modern Europe, heresy was hunted down and punished. But the virulence with which the other countries of Europe approached their task of burning heretics is a story seldom told. Myth can only be destroyed by fact, and the fact is that between 3,000 and 5,000 people perished at the hands of the Inquisition. During that same period, as many as 150,000 witches alone were burnt at the stake for heresy in the rest of Europe. The spectacular rise of the Spanish Empire was to be followed by an uneven but inexorable fall. In the 17th century, the flow of gold and silver from the Americas, which had funded the empire, slowed to a trickle. The state plunged repeatedly into bankruptcy, and the Spanish territories in Europe were relinquished one by one. Their armies no longer marched unmatched across Europe. If Spain's power had been responsible for the myth of the Inquisition in the first place, it might be thought that the myth would disappear as Spain reverted to obscurity. But it didn't. Instead, the Inquisition, a versatile scapegoat, was promptly blamed for Spain's decline as a land as well. Spain was derelict once more, a backwater in European affairs. And by the 18th century, the Inquisition too was enfeebled, dedicating itself to such heresies as drunkenness and swearing in church. Its career was over, but its myth was indestructible.
This legend on the Spanish Inquisition grew, took off, and had a life on its own. And throughout the centuries, it became more and more divorced from reality. In the 18th century, for instance, when Voltaire was crying against the crimes of the Inquisition really was killing nobody. There were no burnings or anything like that in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, when the Inquisition disappeared, they hadn't killed anyone for a very long period of time.
The Inquisition was eventually wound up in this backstreet of Madrid. Yet its supposed horrors were being more vividly presented than ever. The Spanish painter Goya depicted its abuses to satirize the corrupt Spanish government of his day. The now defunct Inquisition could be turned by Dostoevsky to criticize the despotic governments of the Tsars in distant Russia. As a myth, the Inquisition was becoming a shorthand not just for religious fanaticism, but for the repression, injustice and terror that the powerful states of a new modern Europe inflicted on their subjects everywhere. And for that incarnation of the myth of the Inquisition, the 20th century had a special use.
Are you now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist
Party? I ask you again, are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Do you refuse to answer whether or not you are now, have ever been a member of the Communist Party?
You can answer the question, yes or no.
Get rid of this thought. Rid of it. Quickly, before it's too late.
That is not
Double think. Practice it. The party says the earth is flat. True. That's true.
Can be controlled.
The party says 2 and 2 make 5. True.
That, in my opinion, is the basic answer.
No.
An aroused public opinion.
Not no. Forget it.
act on a local level through local law enforcement authorities to wipe out the menace.
Comrades, attention! Our beloved leader,
Are you now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? No. Ask him the next question. Ask him the next question. No. Ever been a member of the Communist Party? That's not the question.
Am I by any chance addressing a senior dignitary of the Spanish Inquisition?
Te gusta la mucha de la Inquisición.
Good. Because if I am, I wish to make it quite clear that I am prepared to tell you absolutely anything.
National stereotypes fulfill very complex functions. On the one hand, they simplify reality. And reality is too complex for the human mind, and we all love simplifications. So, on the one hand, they are useful in that sense, although they, of course, falsify reality. On the other hand, they allow us to project our own unpleasant traits onto another, onto an external entity. Same as in the 16th century, British could believe that all intolerance was Spanish, that is foreign. Well, we can believe in the 20th century that all fascist or Nazi tendencies are German, when we should know that we all have Nazi tendencies, and we should fight our own unpleasant traits instead of projecting them onto another. But it's much more gratifying to expel them.
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
And nobody understands it either. But if you want to learn the truth about the Inquisition, then stick around. It seems like some people, organizations, and governments are hell-bent on bringing down the Catholic Church. The question is, how do you expose opposition to the faith and to the truth? And while they say what you don't know can't hurt you, everybody needs to know about the hidden forces prowling around the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Guess that's where we come in. Follow me. Hello and welcome to this latest edition of CIA, the Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Vorse. In this episode, we're going to take a close look at one of the most popular arguments people make against the Catholic Church. Have you ever been talking to a coworker, a friend, or a family member, trying to share your Catholic faith with them, and then they say something like, well, look at the Inquisition. It forced thousands of people to convert or die. But is that true? Was the Inquisition really as malicious as everybody says it was? And if it wasn't, then where did all the lies and myths come from? Well, guess what? It's time to debunk the myth that the Inquisition used extreme methods of torture to force all non-Catholics to convert to Catholicism or be burned alive at the stake. There's a whole spectrum of confusion about the Inquisition, from serious academic critique to the comedy of the well-known British troupe Monty Python that you saw earlier. Let's listen to what the man on the street knows about the Inquisition.
Basically went about and persecuting anybody that didn't believe specifically what the Catholic Church taught, and found people. There were Muslims and Jews living in Spain at the time, and they either gave them the choice to convert or be put to death, usually.
What do you know about the Inquisition?
Which one?
Whatever ones you know about, you can tell me about.
Spanish Inquisition? I believe that was when the Catholics killed everyone that wasn't Catholic.
They were religious people, and basically they were torturing them if they weren't the right religion, if they weren't Catholic. So anything outside of Catholicism they were tortured for being.
Nothing about the Inquisition.
Well, as you heard, none of them really knew anything about the Inquisition, so let's look at our thesis as we begin to set the record straight. The Inquisitions were instituted to protect both guilty and innocent people from the gross injustice of secular leaders and mob rule, thus initiating an unprecedented level of justice and order throughout much of Europe. So, before we dig into the specifics, we need to lay out a few of the fundamental facts about the Inquisitions. First, the idea of the court of inquisition. A court inquiring into a certain matter is not a Catholic one. Courts of inquisition had been held by secular rulers for a long time, and Protestants had their own anti-Catholic inquisitions as well. Although the name Inquisition may not have been used, it was the same thing. The Catholic Inquisitions existed in many places in medieval and early modern Europe. However, there was never one massive, all-inclusive, pan-European Inquisition. The Inquisitions, plural, were localized circuit courts with the inquisitors traveling around from place to place. Another very important thing to understand about the Inquisitions is that they always started in response to a problem among the church and the faithful. A cleric or king would call for an inquisition because the situation was simply out of hand, and it needed the formalized order of an inquisition in order to be resolved. Unfortunately, the secular rulers would sometimes appropriate the ecclesiastical courts to further their own disingenuous goals. The last general point we'll make here has to do with the most prevalent lie about the Inquisitions, which is that they forced millions of people to convert to Catholicism or be put to death. The fact is that a minute fraction of people were tried and executed. Most people were found innocent. For example, did you know that such intellectual and holy giants of the Catholic Church as St. Teresa of Avila, St. Ignatius of Loyola, and St. John of the Cross were all brought before the Inquisition? Obviously, they were all found to be innocent of heresy and allowed to go free. But that's the point. They were brought to an orderly trial without torture, the evidence was heard, and they were found to be innocent and then set free. The flip side to this is that some Inquisition officials were unjust and cruel and wrongly punished both innocent and guilty people. But we have to understand, while the Catholic Church is a divine institution founded by Jesus Christ, it's made up of weak, sinful human beings who don't always do the will of God, and some have done very bad things. The problem is that the critics of the church will shine a spotlight on those individuals in the church who have done bad things, and then make the argument that the entire church is bad because of the actions of some, usually a few. And this is wholly unjust. It's like having someone who's a criminal in your family and your neighbors then saying that everybody in your family is a criminal. We're not here to say that the Inquisitions were without blame, but what we're going to show is that, by and large, the courts of the Inquisition were the most just and humane legal systems that existed anywhere in Europe at the time. And they were started to protect people from unjust treatment, not to harm them with unjust rulings. All right, so let's bust some of the more prevalent myths. The history of the different Inquisitions comprises over 600 years of convoluted and nuanced detail and events, but we'll try to break everything down as best we can in this short amount of time. To start with, there were three major Inquisitions: the Medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition began when the Holy Office was set up in Rome to deal with the Protestant heresy in the 16th century. We're not going to spend much time on it here because when most people talk about the Inquisition, they're really talking about some confused mix of the first two. The Medieval Inquisition began in 1184 when Pope Lucius III sent a list of heresies to all the bishops in Europe, telling them to oversee the judgment of accused heretics. Thus, the initial courts of Inquisition were conducted by the bishop of a particular diocese. There was no centralized governance. At the time, the secular courts had been harshly and somewhat indiscriminately punishing people they believed to be a threat. Pope Lucius recognized that the accused needed to be protected from individual lords and even mobs. These lynch mobs were a significant problem. One example is of a man who was preaching the Cathar heresy, and he made a bonfire and started preaching beside the bonfire. When he threw a crucifix into the fire and started preaching against our Lord, the people listening rushed him and threw him into the fire. This sort of thing was quite common, and without institutionalizing the Inquisition, this type of behavior would have been allowed to run rampant for who knows how long. Catharism, by the way, is one of the very vaguely Gnostic heresies that sprang up in medieval Europe. The Cathars believed in a dualistic creation. They believed that God had created the soul, which was good, but the devil had created and ruled the physical realm, including our bodies, from which our souls had become trapped and needed to escape. Many people were very angry at these heretics, but it might be a bit hard for us to understand why, as we live in this modern age. In a September 2003 Crisis Magazine article, renowned St. Louis University professor and Catholic apologetic Thomas Madden wrote a top-quality explanation of the Inquisitions. At one point, he explains the cultural milieu that would cause someone to feel justified in burning a fellow human being.
For medieval people, religion was not something one just did at church. It was their science, their philosophy, their politics, their identity, and their hope for salvation. It was not a personal preference, but an abiding and universal truth. Heresy, then, struck at the heart of that truth. It doomed the heretic, endangered those near him, and tore apart the fabric of community.
See, back then, religion wasn't just a personal preference for people. It was real and it mattered. It wasn't something people got involved in to feel good about themselves. It was a way of life, and if something came along to threaten that way of life, it had to be eradicated before it created chaos. Unfortunately, the common people often took the law into their own hands, usually ending in grievous violence and bloodshed, and often the killing of the wrong person anyway. By the 13th century, the violence against the Cathars had grown so bad that in 1231, Pope Gregory IX decided that he had to centralize the authority of all the individual inquisitions in his papal authority at Rome. The Holy Father normalized the Inquisitions by making the Dominicans the official inquisitors and making the Inquisitions answerable to him. The Dominicans had been specially trained in canon law and theology, so they were uniquely suited to handle the Inquisitions. Highly detailed manuals were also printed up and dispersed, which defined how an inquisition was to be conducted. Now stop and think about the situation for a minute. There are bands of angry people roving about Central Europe looking for someone to burn. They start burning supposed heretics because the kings and nobles are all doing the same thing, and they think they have church approval to do this. Finally, Pope Gregory realizes that the church is the only one who can put a stop to this, so he sets up a new court system that is based on Catholic morality. Through the courts of the Inquisition, the Holy Father is trying to ensure everyone will receive respect and justice. Now that doesn't really sound like a sadistic monster relishing the abominable torture of innocent people now, does it? So keep in mind that medieval European law was practically one and the same with church law, and the United States inherited bits and pieces of this legal code when the Founding Fathers used English common law as the basis for the American legal system. To find out more about the Inquisition, we sat down in our RealCatholicTV.com studios and interviewed Canadian author and TV show host Michael Korn about his book, Why Catholics Are Right, a splendid book, by the way. On our interview program, The Roman Forum, Mr. Korn weighed in with a brief overview of the Inquisition. Have a listen.
The Inquisition, look, again, I'm not saying it was wonderful, but the average person saw the Inquisition once every 30 years. There were criminals who would blaspheme, so they could go before the Inquisition rather than a criminal court, because at the Inquisition you had a legal defense. I don't want to tread on toes here, but you had more rights at the Inquisition than you do in Guantanamo Bay. However, let's put that one aside.
So what he's basically saying is that the courts of the Inquisition were way ahead of their time as far as justice and fairness are concerned, but a lot of people try to claim just the opposite. There are many individuals who adamantly argue that the Inquisitions were institutions of unique atrocities and sadistic cruelties perpetrated by hooded and drooling clerics. Garbage like this is just that, garbage. Let's take an example. One of the reasons people give for why the Inquisition is so bad is that when a person was accused of heresy, he wasn't allowed to know who his accuser was. But the person who makes this assertion has no knowledge of the context. It's true that the accusers' names were usually kept secret. This was done because there had been times when the accuser and his family were threatened or even killed for reporting someone to the Inquisition. However, the court balanced this out by letting the accused person produce a list of all his known enemies. Then the court would investigate to see if any of these people had falsely accused the defendant. If the accuser was on the defendant's listed enemies, the court would take his accusation with a huge grain of salt. Inquisition courts also took a very dim view of false witnesses. If someone lied during an investigation, they risked severe punishment for themselves and even death. Besides the process of accusation, there's something else that a lot of people like to get their pants in a knot over, although, like usual, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. People become livid over the Inquisitions as they indignantly, read ignorantly, denounce the Inquisitors' supposed practice of slinking around, forcing non-Catholics to convert or die. Again, this is a load of hogwash. The courts of the Inquisition were set up by the Catholic Church to inquire into whether members of the Church were properly living out their faith. The courts were also trying people for other grave sins like adultery and fornication, severe blasphemy, and immorality among the clergy. Honestly now, does it make sense that the Church would tell another Catholic to convert or die? Clearly, that's not the case. The idea that inquisitors went prowling around Europe, raping women and children as they wrenched conversions out of humble non-Catholics, it's utterly ludicrous. Remember, the Inquisitions weren't perfect, but the express intent and duty of the courts was to provide people with objective justice and fairness. And most of the time, the courts succeeded in holding to a legal standard much higher than anywhere else in the world. Even today, injustice exists in our own court systems, and juries are rigged, judges are taking bribes, bad lawyers provide bad defenses, bad criminals get off on technicalities, etc. Despite all these injustices, no one would sanely stand up and say the whole system is bad and all the people who work in modern courts are crooks and thieves. So what really went on in the Inquisitions? In his book, Why Catholics Are Right, once again, Michael Korn spends some time talking about what the Inquisitions were like, how they were run, and what their real goals were. He explains how a court of Inquisition would have priests stay in a town or a village for a month or so, preaching and teaching and hearing confessions. This was called the period of grace. Anyone who wanted to confess and be forgiven during this period could do so. If the people accused of heresy repented, that was the end of the matter. If they did not, they would be tried, and if found guilty, the Inquisition officials would decide on the method of punishment. Incidentally, most people were not burned at the stake. Common punishments included being required to perform certain good works, such as helping build a church, visiting a church, going on a pilgrimage, or even participating in a crusade, all far cries from being lit up. Stricter punishments could be fines, whippings with rods, the pillory, and wearing colored crosses. A guilty person might also be imprisoned or excommunicated, in which case they would then be handed over to the secular authorities. See, the Inquisitions didn't exactly execute people. If someone's sentence was quite serious, they would be excommunicated, and then punishment was up to the civil courts. In those days, civil and canon law were pretty much united to better serve justice and protect the individual from abuse. Remember, back then, our very modern and recent ideas about the separation of church and state didn't exist at all. Now, although these things are important to understand, we have yet to deal with the most pernicious set of lies. By far, the most serious misconception is that the Inquisition hideously tortured, maimed, and murdered tens of thousands of people merely because the church was trying to force them to become Catholic. This is outrageous. Yes, the courts did sometimes use torture, just like our U.S. government uses torture, or, enhanced interrogation techniques, to obtain desired information. Anyone ever hear of waterboarding? Anyway, what modern man has to understand is that torture was not used as a form of punishment, but for getting at the truth. Inquisitors were keenly sensitive to the need for ironclad proof of an individual's guilt or innocence, and eyewitnesses were considered one of the best ways of securing such proof. But if that proof wasn't easily obtainable, the inquisitors would have to resort to other means of proof. Very infrequently, that meant the defendant and sometimes even the witnesses were tortured for a short period, not to exceed 15 minutes. That was the rule, not to exceed 15 minutes to make sure the inquisitors made the correct judgment. Although it was sometimes ignored, the rule was that no one was allowed to be tortured more than once, and the type of torture could not cause maiming or death or even the risk of death. Incidentally, this may sound very familiar to the U.S. government's practice of waterboarding, which is still highly debated in the United States. So it seems a little disingenuous for modern man to accuse the Catholic Church of unspeakable, heinous practices when similar practices occur today and are still being debated. You need to remember that torture existed long before the courts of the Inquisition, and the Church was always leery about allowing it at all. Pope Innocent IV was the first to allow the use of torture in Inquisition trials. He made the concession in his bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252. Torture was used as a last resort when guilt seemed probable, but there was no other way of being certain of the truth. But many judges recognized that innocent people would sometimes confess to things they didn't do while being tortured just so the pain would end. So a lot of the judges would not attach a heck of a lot of weight to the testimony received under torture. In his 2003 Crisis Magazine article, Professor Thomas Madden gives some specifics of how torture was handled, specifics that obviously blow anti-Catholics' false conceptions of the Inquisitions right out of the intellectual cesspool they like to wallow in. Let's take a listen.
Modern researchers have discovered that the Spanish Inquisition applied torture in only 2% of its cases. Each instance of torture was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes. In only 1% of the cases was torture applied twice, and never for a third time.
Torture was only used in 2% of cases, and yet somehow the only thing the people in our man-on-the-street interviews could tell us was that the Inquisition tortured and killed people. How ridiculous. And ignorance and stupidity of this magnitude can only be chalked up to deliberate lies and deceit on the part of those who hate the Church and want to destroy her. Speaking of modern myths and lies about the Inquisition, remember the Monty Python sketch we opened with? Well, unfortunately, it's always been in vogue to mock the Church and the Spanish Inquisition. But jokes like these are very hurtful because many people form their opinions of the Inquisition based on these fairy tales. To show you what we mean, let's check out another man-on-the-street interview with a young fellow whose sole knowledge of the Inquisition comes from Monty Python.
Like the Spanish Inquisition?
Sure.
It was like a long time ago, and a bunch of Spanish people would like torture people to get, I don't know, I mean, I know they have a Monty Python sketch. It's pretty funny.
Pretty sad, huh? See, the problem is that almost everything people know about the Inquisition and don't know is a convoluted mess of myths and lies. Now stop and think about all of this for a minute. What many people have done is form a radically biased opinion about the Catholic Church, and consequently her teachings, based on ridiculous accusations about the Inquisition, while knowing next to nothing about the facts of the Inquisition. To better understand all of this, we need to take a look at some history to really see why the Inquisitions were seen as necessary and why they operated like they did. When people mention the word Inquisition, they're almost always talking about the Spanish Inquisition. This is probably the most complicated of the three, but it's also the one that needs the most explanation. Now, if you remember from earlier, we talked about the Cathar heresy and how it provided much of the impetus for the institutionalizing of the Inquisition. In the 13th century, there was a great deal of fighting between the Cathars and the Catholic laity who couldn't stand the heretics. Eventually, King James I of Aragon asked Pope Gregory IX to institute an Inquisition there to stop the violence by providing the Cathars with a due process of law. The Pope acquiesced with the decree of his bull Declinante Iam Mundi that he issued on May 26, 1232. Technically, this was the start of the Spanish Inquisition, but it reached its maturity when King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I assumed the throne over 200 years later. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a bull giving Ferdinand and Isabella the permission to establish an Inquisition in Spain. It was run by priests, but the king and queen maintained ultimate control over the court. The first two inquisitors were unscrupulous men, so in the mid-1480s, Ferdinand asked Fray Tomás de Torquemada to step in and become the Grand Inquisitor. He's the priest who's popularly thought to be the devil incarnate, leader of a sadistic cult founded on the idea that torture is good and more torture is even better. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. He had a lot more power than most inquisitors, yes, and he was much more thorough, yes, but he rarely used torture. He also worked incredibly hard to make sure that everyone received justice. Okay, so before we go on, we need to backpedal a little bit and explain the background and the lead up to the institution of the Spanish Inquisition. Remember that the first Inquisitions were started in Central and Western Europe to address the problems surrounding the Cathar heresy. This time, in the 15th century of Spain, the Inquisition was instituted to look into the matter of the conversos, or Jewish and Muslim converts to Catholicism. The point is, none of the Inquisitions were arbitrarily just started up to round people up and force-feed them the Catholic faith or barbecue them. Inquisitions were always begun in response to a specific problem that was being very poorly handled. You see, throughout the entirety of the medieval and early modern Europe, there was a vibrant and vicious anti-Semitism. England and France had expelled all of the Jews in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and many people in Spain were resentful and distrustful of the Jews, and sometimes formed mobs to attack the Jews and force them to convert or die. Many converted, but their conversions were regarded with suspicion because they'd been done under force. These forced conversions were neither handled nor endorsed by the Catholic Church, and yet today, that's the impetus for them. The impetus for them is laid solely at the feet of the Church. Now, by the time Ferdinand and Isabella took power, the original conversos had been dead for centuries, and their descendants were ethnically and culturally Jewish, but at the same time devout Catholics. There were also still a lot of Jews and Muslims in Spain as well. Because they were Catholic, these conversos were able to own land and business and began to amass wealth. Unfortunately, they also gained the envy and resentment of the so-called pure Catholics in Spain. People began to spread rumors that the conversos were part of a huge Jewish plot to infiltrate and destroy the nobility and the church. Accusations began to swirl and escalate until the king and queen finally asked Pope Sixtus IV to allow the crown to set up an inquisition in Spain, which he did, as we said, in 1478. The court almost immediately became submerged under a deluge of accusations against the conversos. In his interview, Michael Koren also talked about the unstable environment in Spain at this time.
So the Inquisition, it was about nationalism. Spain, there were dozens of Inquisitions. Nothing much happened. It's the Spanish Inquisition people talk about. Spain was a new nation state, besieged on all sides. It was nervous about would it exist in the future, so it required to be a Spaniard, you had to be a Catholic. Problem. It shouldn't have been, and so Jews and Muslims were told convert or leave. Many converted, and they weren't really Christian. There were volumes of laws that had to be applied if you were taken to the Inquisition. I'm not saying it was the right thing, but compared to the rest of the world, it was actually rather civilized.
So because of all the fear and unrest at the time in Spain, Spain decided independently of the Catholic Church, and that's important, independently of the Catholic Church, that the Inquisition would be the tool used to ensure the loyalty of the conversos to the state. Remember, Spain and Portugal had just recently kicked the Muslim forces out of the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista, but there were still lots of Muslims and Muslim converts to Catholicism living in Spain. The Spanish were suspicious of these Muslims, as well as of the large Jewish population, because sometimes the Jews had fought with the Muslims against the Catholics, and this had endangered the stability of the Spanish state. What you see here, then, is that the Inquisition was used by the state, Ferdinand and Isabella, to promote Spanish loyalty through the religion of the state. Interestingly, though, even in the heyday of the supposedly dreadful Spanish Inquisition, there was only a fraction of the executions all those modern uninformed intellectuals tell us there were. Here's the point. The peak of the Spanish Inquisition was during Queen Isabella's 30-year reign, from 1474 to 1504, and Torquemada's time as Grand Inquisitor mostly coincided with Queen Isabella's reign. So, under Isabella's rule, about 15,000 people were convicted of heresy, but repented and were accepted back into the church. Unfortunately, about 2,000 people were convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. Now, are we saying that those 2,000 people don't matter? No. Are we saying that it's okay to burn people who teach lies? No. What we are saying is that the lies you'll hear from your ignorant, run-of-the-mill anti-Catholics are completely unsubstantiated by the facts of the matter. So, here's some quick statistics we made using those same numbers. Under Queen Isabella, 12% of the people convicted, not the people tried, but the people convicted, were burned at the stake. The other 88% of the people convicted of heresy repented and were sent away free. These numbers prove that the Inquisition officials weren't bloodthirsty devils who were craving violence and death and torture. What the percentages show is that the Spanish Inquisition was much more interested in getting Catholics to live out their faith than in killing them. And you have to remember, life in the 15th century was filled with uncertainties regarding personal safety, political upheaval, and just having enough food to feed your family. People were trying to survive in a period of time fraught with ignorance, deprivation, and fear of conquest. That's important, fear of conquest. And although the courts of the Inquisition helped hold some of that danger back, the Inquisition officials were still affected by their culture and society, which had a very black and white understanding of survival and justice. Let's listen again to Michael Korn as he talks about the relationship between the church and the European society that the church had helped to build. He explains why people who belong to the divinely founded Catholic Church sometimes still do very bad things.
The church has been at its worst when it's most resembled the culture, when it's given in, when it's changed with the times.
Here's the point. The Inquisition officials and state rulers were violent, but this begs the question, are we any less violent today? Back in the Middle Ages, violence was common and people often settled disagreements by killing each other, and sometimes with little cause, according to modern-day standards. This was the prevailing attitude of both monarchs and the common folk. In the 20th and 21st centuries, however, there is just as much a violent approach among leaders and common people as there was 600 years ago. Communist regimes, for example, executed over 100 million of their own citizens, and still counting, and in the West, hundreds of millions of people have been killed through abortion and euthanasia. The question can fairly be asked, are we really that much more advanced than those who abused their Inquisition powers? We could actually be looking back to the Inquisitions as models of restraint and how to mete out justice. Now, in case these comparisons seem a bit far removed, let's look at some much more proximate examples to the Inquisition. Something a lot of people don't know is that while the Catholic Inquisitions were going on, there were also many Protestant Inquisitions, although they didn't use that name, that they hunted down and killed anyone who wouldn't convert to Protestantism by turning away from the Catholic Church. A far different story than the Catholic Inquisitions. These happened after the Protestant rebellion in some of the German and Low Countries. There were also Inquisitions in England under King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, his daughter. After Henry made himself the supreme head of the church in England and started forcing everyone to convert to Anglicanism, a lot of his subjects refused. So Henry simply taxed them or took all of their property and killed them. It was like the Catholic Inquisitions on steroids. Even after Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, took the throne, there were still a great many Catholics secretly practicing their faith. So Elizabeth commanded her soldiers to seek out, arrest, torture, and butcher the Catholics for such minor offenses as attending Mass, hiding a priest, or refusing to attend Protestant services. Here's Michael Korn again to give us a little better idea of the religious tolerance that Catholics got from Good Queen Bess.
In England, Good Queen Bess, is always on TV these days, being played by some actress or other. She was hanging, drawing, and quartering people. I won't go into the details here, people might be eating their dinner, but hanging, drawing, and quartering innocent people simply because they were Catholic. There was no Inquisition in Central Europe. The 30 Years' War, the first example of total warfare. Villages wiped out, hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered.
You see, thousands of Catholic bishops, priests, nuns, and laymen were tortured and killed because they did not profess England's state religion. These people were hunted down and dragged before the Protestant courts to be tried for heresy. The only thing that was their crimes of heresy were that they believed in the Catholic faith and refused to follow Henry's man-made religion. There are a great many English martyrs, at least a few of their names should be familiar to you. Veritable giants of the faith, like St. Sir Thomas More, who refused to trample on his faith for Henry VIII's nonsense, and St. Edmund Campion, a young priest who brought the sacraments to his spiritual children until he was finally apprehended and slaughtered. So let's think about this for a second. Henry and Elizabeth told all non-Anglicans to convert or die. The Catholic Inquisition told other Catholics that if they were going to call themselves Catholic, they just had to live out their faith. And yet, as the myth goes, Catholics are the evil ones, and Queen Elizabeth will forever be remembered as Good Queen Bess. This makes absolutely no sense, and it's the result of the same propaganda that made the Spanish Inquisition be remembered as infamous. All right, so now we know that the popular ideas about the Inquisition have little or nothing to do with reality, but where did all these lies come from? Well, they came from several different sources. The first people who spread lies about the Inquisition were other European countries. Think about it. Spain's Inquisition began in 1478. Just 14 years later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, who was sponsored by Isabella and Ferdinand, discovered the New World that was rich with all sorts of treasures. As the 16th century dawned, Spain entered her golden age, a period of great wealth, influence, prosperity, and military power. All of the surrounding countries who had similar desires of conquering the New World and advancing their kingdoms were both really jealous and really fearful of Spain's rise to power. So the newly minted Protestant countries of Germany and England, who'd been less than 100 years old at this point, helped by the printing press, began to wage a propaganda war against Spain and thus created the Black Legend. The Black Legend is a set of myths basically saying that the Spanish were a superstitious people still stuck in what is sometimes erroneously called the Dark Ages. On his website, dedicated to the promotion of the Catholic faith, musician and apologist David MacDonald presents an in-depth analysis of the Inquisitions. At one point, he explains how the Black Legend was developed and promoted. Listen to this.
Two important Protestant publications in it were John Fox's Book of Martyrs and a leaflet published in 1567 penned by a supposed Inquisition victim named Montanus. He painted Catholic Spaniards as barbarians who ravished women and sodomized young boys. The propagandists soon created hooded fiends who tortured their victims in horrible devices like the knife-filled Iron Maiden. The number of victims was exaggerated. Fox claimed 32,000 were burned at the stake. The myth became the accepted stereotype, as seen in Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, in The Brothers Karamazov, and in Edgar Allan Poe's Tale of the Pit and the Pendulum.
These early lies were continued in the mid-1800s by Protestant writers, and we've inherited these same myths and prejudices today from grammar school history classes on up. You see, the Protestant authors really only wanted to attack the Catholic Church and not Spain. So they took advantage of the myths and lies about the Spanish Inquisition and just redirected them from a mainly anti-Spanish focus to an anti-Catholic one. It eventually became chic for liberated, nose-in-the-air, and enlightened modern men to hold in a dignified horror the base atrocities committed by fanatical papists several hundred years earlier. Of course, now, after decades of having mainstream culture caving into the myths and lies, Muslims, Jews are loudly protesting the supposedly gross cruelties committed against them during the Inquisition. It's ridiculous to hold on to all these lies about the Inquisition, just like it's ridiculous for people to bash the Spanish for taking back their lands that had been stolen from them by the Muslims in the first place. I mean, after all, the poor Muslims had only peacefully conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula and lovingly slaughtered, burned, and raped entire towns. So, the next time you're having lunch with co-workers or holiday or family dinners with your anti-Catholic family members or friends, what are you going to say when someone brings up the Inquisition? Well, here's a few points you want to remember. Number one, there were a lot of local inquisitions that tried baptized Catholics for grave sins against their faith. Number two, the Inquisitions introduced a new and much more just legal structure that our own court system has actually borrowed from. And point number three, the Spanish monarchy used the Inquisition to protect its national security at a time when it was in great danger from Muslim aggression. Remember, just like in Anglican England and Lutheran Germany, Catholic Spain saw religion as inseparable from patriotism and loyalty to the crown. Catholic monarchs saw religious belief as protecting the political stability of the country because they knew that their stability relied on the bedrock of natural law, established by God and delivered to them by Christ and His Catholic Church. As we've seen, it's clear that there is a huge amount of misinformation that was purposely spread among the public to twist popular opinion against the Catholic Church. But now you know the truth and understand the arguments about the Inquisition. So you're now armed with the real facts needed to combat the nefarious assaults that people love to hurl against the Catholic Church. The ultimate thing to take away from all of this is that you should always cherish your faith, love the Church, and never cease to work to spread her message to the world. For the faith is our pearl of great price, our life, and our hope. So now you know. Thanks for watching this edition of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Voris. Let's hit the streets.